He needs to be watched.
I'm in kicking distance under the table.
Good afternoon. 5 minutes behind schedule, but we're in good shape. Welcome to today's work session, and we'll go ahead and get right started. Continuing our work that falls under the heading of the goals for long-term success. But this is really looking at how do we make sure that every school across our district is strong and that opportunity creator that every school should be. I believe, Michael, you're heading it off?
Yes.
All right.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So what I'd like to do with the time we have today, so we basically have from now until 4 o'clock, is sort of build on what we did 2 weeks ago. I think there's an opportunity to go a little more in-depth into what the targets that we talked about at the last meeting actually look like. So one of the things that we have prepared is just a look at those specific targets and how they would play themselves out. One of the pieces of feedback that we got from you all was thinking about, okay, what does this look like at elementary, middle, and high school? So we want to kind of talk you through, and we have some sort of graphical ways of representing that, just to get your head around what those targets would mean for the actual schools. And again, I think we left the last meeting wanting to be clear that this is going to take a while. So one of the things that we talked about was putting this in a larger context, a larger timeline, to make sure that as we communicate out, we know when this would actually begin to impact schools. So we have a larger sort of timeline laid out as well. For that. And then I think the last thing we wanted to do with our time is that at all of the meetings we've talked about the need for stakeholder engagement. So I'll say that we have put a provisional target here just to kind of get your thinking going. But I think at the last meeting we heard very clearly that the targets are only for feedback, right? So when we present the targets, we'll just do that so that you can understand the kind of math underlying it, but really understand that we heard at the last meeting that the purpose of this was to make sure that we clearly communicated it and that we had an opportunity throughout this school year and next school year to get community feedback on that target. So that is what we're going to set out to do with our time. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to talk through first, just to ground us again, that we really want to be grounded in the purpose. And the purpose is really about student and student outcomes. And so we believe that reducing socioeconomic imbalance in schools is a key action among many to achieve that goal. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a provisional, measurable, time-bound goal for decreasing socioeconomic imbalance for community feedback, right? So we're going to talk through what that looks like, what we would take out to schools and the community to get feedback on. We heard a feedback from our draft year-long plan for the work sessions. We made a few updates to that. So we want to just go back through that. And then we want to spend time, the last 45 minutes, just discussing, in that timeline from bullet 2, we discussed a stakeholder involvement plan that would come to the board in October. And so we want to give you guys, at the second meeting, we talked about who the stakeholders were. But in this discussion, we want to talk about what questions do you want to ask stakeholders, how do you want to ask, like what means do you want to use, and then I think some of the feedback we got last time is what are the key messages? Like what is the purpose of why we are doing this? So we want to give you guys an opportunity to provide that feedback to the staff as they put together a communication plan for the October work session. So those are objectives for the day. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to, oh, yes, thank you. The other thing, as we mentioned last time, you guys have parking lot documents that we used from last time that were very valuable. Clearly, one of the things that we heard was just the need for community involvement. Again, we'll ask that as we work through today, if you have parking lot items that you want to capture, please make sure that you're recording those, and we'll pick those up at the end of the session.
So during the last meeting, we agreed with the methodology presented by the staff to use the census block data because it was used across the county. It was one of the communication points that other industries use. And so this data, we wanted to focus on the economic health ranking to think about socioeconomic imbalance. And so that was, we agreed upon the methodology for that. And then we also took some time to look at different ranges. We looked at plus and minus 10, 15, 20, and 25% of schools in terms of being outside of that range connected to the 50th percentile. So we worked through some of that data and answered some of the questions that came up. And then what we talked about is focusing on, for elementary schools, schools within the 20th percentile points of the 50th percentile overall. And then for middle and high schools, to look at schools that were above and below the 15th percentile points of the 50th percentile. And so we're going to today get more concrete and looking specifically at data around elementary schools that are above and below the 20th percentile points of the 50th percentile. And then for middle and high schools to look at just those that are plus or minus 15 percentile points of the 50th percentile. So I do want to remind everyone that this is tentative, that we're looking at this data, and this isn't around action. So we did ask you all to come to consensus so that we can make sense of the goal that we're working towards, but just making sure that we're grounded in, we're using this information to help us better understand our goal and where we're going in terms of action and community feedback.
Could you restate for us the difference in making reference to 50th percentile than to some other number like we've used in the past, which is a percent of students in a building for this goal? Because there is a difference, and I want to make sure our media partners and public understand that there's a difference.
Yeah, so if we go back.
I think we're still looking at percentage of children in a school, but it's children in this health index as opposed to eligible for free and reduced lunch. But we're still looking at the percentage of children in the school, I think.
Well,
Yeah. So if we look at this last piece from our methodology, we looked at percentiles provided by staff that represent the average score of the Health Economic Index for the census block for students in the base zone and also for students actually attending the school, which is the data that we reviewed that looked like.
It's economic health.
Economic health, that's right.
So I get why we're doing it this way for this. I'm just struggling with how we're going to get the public to understand when we say a school that's at 70% is really, we mean it's a school at more than 58%. Because our percent middle is different than 50%. I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to get the public to understand. And I guess as we go through this, we're going to start breaking it down by base of schools versus 50%. Because our average is not 50% in Wake County.
well, that's my point in asking the question.
Yeah, I know. That's
is
the
it
point.
50th percentile as opposed to 50% of children or 50% of schools? It's the 50th percentile of where the schools rank based on applying the health index.
So are we talking about median or mean?
Well, the public's not going to totally
No,
understand that.
but we have to know that so we can interpret it.
We need to make sure.
I think we're talking about the mean, the median,
We're talking about the median. So
which means if you take all of our schools and we've got not quite 200 schools, but let's take 200 because it's easy.
We'll take elementary, take 140.
We can take all 200 schools, right? We've got 200 schools. That says 100 schools above and 100 schools below. That's our reference.
That's the midpoint.
That's our midpoint.
Right.
But nobody knows what our midpoint is.
Our midpoint is our midpoint. So right now...
Okay, now I got it.
No. It's not as hard as you think it is, right? Because our free and reduced lunch population, which is what we've historically talked about, is the average is 30.
But that's not the conversation we're having.
I know. See, you're getting into where I say people are used to us talking about.
Right. We're saying 20% above the midpoint. So we're looking at the 30th to 70th percentile of the schools.
If our midpoint is 38%, we're saying if
That's the
about
range we want schools to be
58%,
within.
Right.
Not 70%.
And my suggestion, if it would be, I think you're going to want to have some concrete examples in the presentation materials. So somebody can literally just follow it. This is what we mean. School A, School B. This is how it breaks down, so everybody can see it straight up, and that there's not going to be then confusion.
Yeah, and I understand what they're doing. I just want our public.
Right, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
I think some concrete examples, because once you start talking about it in abstract, it does get, I think, less accessible.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point for the last conversation we're going to have today, which I think one of the things is just how do we want to communicate this? So I think really one of the things that I'm hearing you guys saying is like, let's have, in a page or two, a kind of graphical representation of the methodology so that the public can see in pretty quick order what it is that we're doing against the 50th percentile, and maybe even like how schools array against the 50th percentile might be helpful.
Well, I would suggest that we need it in a sentence or two when we're done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is where we are going to have to understand the difference between the median and the mean. We don't have to use that language, but we're going to have to show it visibly.
Yeah.
Because if everything is a normal distribution, your median and mean are the same value. If it's not a normal distribution, if it's skewed, which is what this is going to be, then the median and mean will not be the same thing.
Yep.
Yes, so we're talking about the median 50th percentile of the economic health index for the schools today. And we looked at base-only population and actual students attending the school. And as we look through these two goals, we're going to focus on actual attendance at the schools in terms of the socioeconomic imbalance.
Okay. So I think one of the things then we wanted to do from this is just sort of thinking about these goals that we sort of agreed to at the last meeting. We wanted to talk about what this actually means in terms of number of schools. So we did some sort of graphical representation to represent, kind of what we're actually dealing with. One of the conversations we had last time is how many schools currently are within range. And we wanted to make that clear based on these targets that you agreed to. So we're going to have a sort of a graphical representation of how we thought about this, and that will get us towards thinking about like what a provisional goal would be, how many schools we want to be within range. So using the database the Health Economic Index, I wanted to break it out by elementary schools and by middle schools. So in our sample, 117 schools, 14 of those schools, if we use the actual students attending the schools, not the base assignment, 14 are between the 0 and 30th percentile countywide. Those are higher economic indices. 16 schools are between the 70th and 100th at the elementary school level. That's actual students. So last time you were presented with both base and actual. But we wanted to say, I mean, obviously the thing we care about is the actual students attending the school. So to just kind of walk through what that would be, that's 14 above and 14 below. So by percentages, 87 schools, 74% are within plus or minus 20 percentile points of the 50th percentile, right? So those are schools that are not disproportionately higher or lower economic indices. And there are 30 schools, or 26%, that are outside. That's 14 higher indices and 16 lower indices. And I will say as well, you all have maps of these schools that were included in your board packet that Glenn and his team prepared. So if we then look at middle schools, we have 38, not including application-only schools. Of those 38 schools, 8 schools are between the 0 and 35th. And remember, we said that the 15th percentile was recommended by staff to have sort of a similar number of schools that we would be looking to influence. 6 schools are between the 65th and 100th percentile. So those are lower economic indices schools. Those are lower wealth schools. By the percentages, that's 24 schools, 63% are within plus or minus 15 percentile points of the 50th percentile, and 37% are outside. That's 8 higher indices, 6 lower indices. Again, that is actual against base. Math making sense? And I just want to say that I think one of the things that I'm taking away from the conversation we just had 5 minutes ago is we also need to show in a sentence and maybe a graphic the 50th percentile. And that's the next step that we will take from this meeting to make sure that we have that for you guys to look at.
So, do you mind if I just break that down into sort of layman's terms?
Yes.
So that means 8 schools, when you say the higher economic indices are more affluent, higher socioeconomic status, whatever you call it.
Yep.
6 are low wealth or high needs schools. And so the 24 schools, 63% are within plus or minus. So we're going to say 24 schools are good, or okay, or healthy, balanced. For layman's terms, we're going to say 24 are okay. Where we wanted to be.
Or where we're talking.
Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think this point was made at the last meeting. I think the question is, this is not just about like isolating. I think from your perspective, I heard you guys say this is not about singling out particular schools, but a larger sort of desire to have balanced schools across the board. So I think there's a big question in there and about target setting, do we want to employ things for schools that are within that help for balance as well? But based on the methodology, that means that 24 of these middle schools are within plus or minus 15 percentile of the median, the 50th percentile. But yes, the way you said it is accurate.
Yeah, I think where you were going a little bit, Michael, is that to solve any issues, it doesn't mean we only pay attention to the 14
Absolutely.
schools, because the 24 are going to have to be part of the solution. You can't just say, take your polar extremes and solve everything by mixing polar extremes. Right. Ms. Kushner.
Well, and the graphic in the top left corner has them nicely spaced out.
Yeah.
But when we look at the map, it's not.
Absolutely. That's right.
They're like this.
Can we, yeah, good point. So I think we need
And I think,
Yes, pretty much.
yeah, that was an intentional choice,
Yeah, that's very aspirational.
right?
Aspirational, good.
So basically, then in high schools, 24, 7 of those schools are between the 0 and 35th percentile. That means higher economic indices. 5 between the 65th and 100th percentile. That would mean by the percentages, 12 schools are within and 12 schools are outside. So I think this was suggested by you all at the last meeting, but we wanted to kind of be able to break it down into a couple tables to make sure it was really clear before we start, going forward with this. So overall, that means there are 14 elementary schools, 8 middle, and 7 high schools that have disproportionately higher economic indices. And 16, 6, and 5 that have disproportionately lower economic indices based on this methodology.
This is very helpful.
Good. So that's 29 schools with higher economic indices, 27 with lower economic indices compared to the countywide median. And so then if you put that all into a table, then you can see the distribution of those schools. And on the far right, you have schools with economic indices within the range. So in middle and high, that's plus or minus 15. In elementary, that's plus or minus 20. And I think one of the things that was mentioned at the last meeting that I think you all observed and is very evident when you see the base and the assigned maps is that in many cases, the students actually attending school, there are fewer schools outside of the range in the actual case than would be if students just attended their base. And from that, we concluded that at least, certainly at the elementary school level, it appears that set of policies and practices that are in place now are having some effect toward socioeconomic balance at the elementary school. But that said, using this methodology, we see that there's quite a few schools, 31%, that fall outside of this methodology. So at this point, what I want to do, and I want to say at the next couple slides, I want to make very clear that these are for the sake of kind of taking our kind of the logic that we laid out to its logical conclusion. But this is not to say that this is the target we have to set. But I wanted to make sure that we could go through the process of thinking about what the target might be and have that kind of methodology in our head as we think about how we want to communicate this out, as we think about how we would gather feedback over the next 2 years. Go ahead.
As part of that, because setting a target is not going to be as simple as, I think, drawing a line.
Right.
When I look at these schools, I feel like I'm going to need to know, right? So if we're looking at 50 plus or minus 20, let's just do the elementary school, right? That means we're down to 30 or up to 70.
Yep.
How many of those outlier schools are in the 20 to 30?
Yeah. Yeah.
How many are in the 10 to 20? How many are below 10? And vice versa on the other side. Because if how you set your target is going to be very much dependent on how far away from your set points your actual data is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely something that we can do. And it's interesting, the maps they actually show the percentile like in a little table to the left hand, but I can see how we could sort of condense that into something that would be understandable. And I think Mr. Sutton made this point at the last meeting is like, what distance from kind of being in range are you? And I think what we'll see is that of those 30 elementary schools, there's some that are quite close to being in range and some that are quite far. Mm-hmm. And I think to the point, like, one of the things that I think we discussed was just, there's another world in which we set these targets as growth targets, where we would say if you're at the 98th percentile, meaning like based on this model, you're at a very low wealth index, do we actually want to say what we would want to do is set a target for growth so that you move Because you could easily move from the 98th percentile to the 75th percentile and not necessarily be within range. So that's another thing for us to think about, because all the schools that are out of range are not all equidistant outside of range. So let's just talk briefly through what this. So this is the thing that we were presented at the last meeting: percent of schools that will be within range by what school year. And I think, to the chair's point, I mean, I think this metric that we're going to talk about here is simply for the purpose of wanting to make sure that we have an idea of where we'd like to be, but not necessarily. We imagine the goal that we're going to talk about as being something that we would get feedback from the community on, not something that we would just set. But we do want to think about what it would look like. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the math to kind of give you a sense of this. So if there are 56 out-of-range schools based on this methodology, okay? So that's either they're disproportionately different than the county median. So that's the 29 plus the 27. Okay? So if Wake County Public Schools were to implement practices and policies starting in 21-22, which is the time frame we're talking about, we're not talking about doing this for next school year, that enable 80%, so a large portion of those 56 schools out of range to become within range within 4 years. That would mean 45 of those 56 schools. And again, this is meant for you all to be thinking about as a possible target, not as the target that needs to be set. So that would be 45 schools. So then, assuming the 123 in-range schools currently stay in range, which to the point that's been made, like all schools should be thinking about this. And so we'd want to think about that as well. But assuming those schools stay in range, then if you had 45 additional schools by virtue of choice policies and all of the discussions that we're going to have throughout the course of this year, if we would move 45 of those 56 schools, that'd be 160 schools within range by 25-26. That'd be 168 out of the 179. So that's 94% of all schools would be within range. That's if we basically say we'll take 4 out of every 5 schools that are out of range right now, and by virtue of careful myriad policies and practices over the next 5 years, that would represent a pretty significant number of schools being within range of the overall.
And that would assume all the new schools are going to try to be there too?
I think that's another thing that we'd have to think about, right, as we add new schools.
Because we have 2 that are on this list.
And renovations that have added capacity.
Yeah, but that'll be, you're right. Some are moving, some are.
And we can't forget to factor that into when we're making magnet changes like Lincoln Heights.
Right.
That changes just on this sheet alone.
I noticed that.
Yes.
So that is just to talk you all through, how we think about this. Because I think one of the things that was discussed in the last meeting as well was, there are going to be schools that often, because of geographical challenges, it may present a significant challenge to move those within range. And so we wanted to think about you guys set out with this goal, but we also want to make sure that it's feasible, right, over time. And so just to kind of give you a sense of why this particular goal, a couple of things that we're thinking of. At the very first meeting we had in June, you all said that you felt like achieving a goal like this is part of a solution to ensure every child has a great opportunity, right? So setting this goal moves us in that direction. That's one component of what you aspire to for the system. Secondly, we feel like it balances ambition and feasibility. So if 45 schools, if there's 56 schools that are out of range and 45 would move in, that still means that 11 schools might theoretically be outside of this range. But again, we thought that was pretty important given geographical challenges and just wanting to set something that is actually achievable, right? And it also, I think, allows for, roughly 1 or 2 schools at each grade level that might lie outside of the range, but still makes a fundamental shift in really imbalanced schools. And lastly, I think starting out and actually doing the math now and talking through it allows us ample time for community feedback and modification. So again, I think we left at the last meeting wanting to say we don't want the target to be set without community feedback. But we also felt like it was important to actually go through what the methodology would look like in order to get that feedback. So let me stop right there before we go on. A couple of things that I've heard thus far is we definitely need to show simply how the 50th percentile indices work. That's an addition that we can absolutely do in collaboration with staff. And we need to think about representing the distance from being in range for all the different schools. And the growth target, yes.
Ms. Cash, then Ms. Mahaffey.
This may be somewhere in our presentation, I missed it, but when we're looking at the schools that are out of range, I would love to see them identify about which ones have programming already that have not addressed what they were supposed to be addressing.
Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, if there's a magnet program in a school that is there to attract
Gotcha. Yep.
diversity, but is not, if that could be identified so I can have a better idea of the program impact as well as the student assignment impact.
Yes. And I think that's...
Oh, is that on there? It shows me the magnet piece?
No, it doesn't show you the magnet. You have to know
Oh,
it's a
yeah,
magnet.
that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and I think that's a big reason we did that sort of year-long timeline is because we want to devote a full one of these meetings to thinking about how is magnet policy working or not working across schools outside of range.
Okay, thank you very much.
But yeah, we'll definitely have that data.
So I can identify, I should know most of them, but I don't identify all of them.
And to piggyback on what Ms. Cash is saying about programming, what are the transportation options for parents to get to that programming? If all you have is parent-provided transportation to a magnet, that makes it increasingly difficult to attract students.
Or express for
to it. Or express, right, where your express stop is maybe a 15, 20-minute drive from the school.
Yeah, and one of the things, the thing that we're going to do in October would be removing barriers to access, so thinking about some of those
Yeah, that's a giant piece. Transportation needs
Well,
to be here.
I think your point is absolutely well taken, and it's got to be looking at both the schools that have programming that's not appropriately being accessed, but let's look at what's working as well, because we can learn from what's working and say, hey, we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. We can look at our successful programs and say, hey, maybe we need some more of these. Ms. Kushner.
I mean, if you just look at the first two maps,
Eventually.
base area versus attending for the elementary schools, they're very different.
What file are you in?
You have, it's the maps,
Base area is?
yeah, and the base seem to have many more schools that are 70% to 100% high needs. So I think you can see how those programs are being utilized. And of the 9 that are in the 70s with actual, 5 of them are magnets. So it could be that those would be easier to bring into the range that we want them to be, because they have choice options available to us.
If we have room for the base.
I appreciate the timeline where the feedback period is not just this year, but also next year as well, and then setting the goal 5 years after that initial feedback period. And I think that's really important to highlight is this is not a goal that we're setting for 5 years from now. It's for 5 years after we've spent 2 years speaking with and hearing from the community. I think that's just an important highlight as we go through this, that we're not doing it in a vacuum.
Yes, and that's a wonderful, I think it's a good point to transition because we thought a lot about that. We felt like it was really, I think from your feedback at the last meeting, that it's really important to say, to communicate clearly what the direct timeline was, right? And the sense about when these things would happen. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Frederica to talk a little bit about how we've laid out both the sort of longer term timeline.
Before we go to timeline, I think there was a couple more questions. I have one as well. Mr. Thomas, have your hand.
Yeah, so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about, like, if you looked at this as the same as our argument around A through F grading, and you're talking about proficiency versus growth. And if you looked at our number of schools, and that would be like saying 94% of all schools are proficient. But then if you're allowing for then growth, and I want to call growth improvement.
Yeah.
So instead of a set target number of schools, that we're looking at sort of this range of continuous improvement. Because what got me was your slide before that said assuming that all 123 schools will stay in balance.
Right.
To me, that's probably not a good assumption to make, because almost for certain there will be schools that move in and out of that all the time. So if we're going to then allow for that, if we set a goal of then what is optimal for the district? So if we're at 123 schools, we've got based on the formula here, we've got 179. So if it's realistic to say, for example, 150 schools is our optimal target at any given time. If we're kind of in the optimal range, you would have a certain number of schools. And then the goal is to stay within sort of this range of continuous improvement. That way you're allowing for both balance, ambition, and feasibility, but also because you're going to have shifts in population, you're going to have what I would call sort of shifts of improvement. Because as we implement this and you then move resources, move students, or whatever will happen, then again, some schools are going to improve and fall out, and then others, as we kind of, for lack of a better word, take away, schools may then fall out, suffer, whatever you want to call it. So I'm just kind of thinking a little bit out loud and sort of being devil's advocate to this proposal and thinking about, again, allowing for those shifts that are going to happen, and then is the goal then a specific target, or is the goal then, like I said, this range of continuous improvement? Because you're going to, again, because you're always going to have these shifts and there's always going to be this movement of schools based on all the things that we're implementing. And if we're successful, then again, you're going to see schools move in and out, or you're going to see schools in the western part of the county gain more population, or there's some overcrowding, there's some undercrowding. So all these factors that will impact that. Am I making,
you are.
am I making sense?
No, you are. I got an additional devil's advocate to that.
I think the number's probably up closer to 10 years now. But in theory, 100% of the population will change where they live every 10 years. I mean, everybody doesn't, but the number of people who will move used to be every 7 years. It doesn't turn over that much today. But that's something we have no control over. That will impact all of our schools. So
if you think about it in this way, that kind of allows for that kind of piece as well, and then we're not kind of stuck at this 94% or 92% or 97% or whatever the number is. There's more of a range of then, like I said, range of continuous improvement. And so, you might say, we will seek to maintain a district balance or district goal of each year seeing improvement towards a goal.
So that's where I was going, because you and Mr. Fletcher just listed the things that we can't control, but the thing we do control to some degree is putting forth enrollment plans that help us. So you ended where I didn't see you going, which is I think we also have to own at this table that the board is going to be responsible for maintaining that, given all the fluctuations that we can, right? I mean, people have to give us data for us to actually output better assignments or enrollments that match what we're asking for. But I do think it's going to have to be, and I'm speaking for Monica, a reminder that we have to do that and be conscious of, if we just let things move for the next 4 or 5 years, we're not going to be talking about 56 schools, right? We're going to,
That's right.
It could potentially be a greater number. So I guess my devil's advocate was, okay, this is a great plan for 25, but what are we going to commit to from now till then? Because I feel like if we're talking about this, I appreciate that we're committed to community feedback, but we also have to be responsible for walking that walk for the next 5 years too. And so I just think it's necessary to say, to your point, we can't control all those factors, but at least at this table, I'm willing to say we have to be willing to do something every year so that we're not slipping further and further down a pathway that makes this goal less obtainable because of all the factors Mr. Sutton just mentioned.
Yeah, you and I spoke, we were looking at each other a little bit. I mean, 7 years is a long time to me. And especially with elected boards, and it's a very lofty goal. I have a little more urgency in my mind about it than that. And I know public input is important, but our public changes constantly. And even if there will be people moving in the week before we've reached our goal and still say we didn't know about this. So you're right. We need to take ownership of this and move it along, as well as being sure our administrative staff is 100% behind what we're doing, so that if we have magnet programs that aren't quite doing what we'd like to, we really can't wait 2 or 3 years to make some changes or leadership changes. All these things that we know are critical to making this a very well diverse, healthy school system. So 7 years is a long time to me. But, I know it's a lofty goal, so I agree with you. We need to look every year at where the progress is, or we're never going to be any further ahead.
I'm wondering if we shouldn't, one of the things that we might take away from this is devote a small portion of our time in October to just looking at how we could track growth over these years. Because I think, as Frederica will talk about, the timeline imagines impactful decisions that you all would begin making starting next year, right, after this conversation. So the target is, out over time to be feasible, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you all, in fact, certainly wouldn't mean that you all wouldn't begin making important decisions toward that goal. And so I'm almost thinking, to kind of pick up on Mr. Sutton's point too, that we could suggest how we might track that, right? So we have these measures, and we know that there are certain schools that are, in the 97th, 98th percentile. So we could kind of create just like that outline of what a dashboard would look like, so that over the course of this work, you will see and can be sort of updated on how indices are moving over time. And then the long-term goal may stay in place, but there's also a sense that you think about both, are the 123s that are schools that are in range staying within range, right. And you're able to kind of keep track of progress towards the ultimate goal, which is not just a numerical target, but this sort of sense of actually balanced.
It helps me know that administration and the board are accountable for where we're going, because that's important to me.
So I think the numerical goal is something that's important for us to think about and put in a little bit better context. Twofold. One is, I think we need to understand history. I don't have access to the historical economic health indicator index, so we've got to use the free and reduced lunch numbers because that's what we have. The best I can calculate, we had on the order of 21% of our schools outside of this range in 2008-9. So I think that's important for us to put in context, right? That's a decade ago. So if you're going to put numbers down, and 95% is something that everybody loves because it's just a number that sounds good. But we got to be realistic, and that's why I think understanding history is important. So we're 10-ish% worse now than we were a decade ago, is the best I can sort of estimate based on numbers. Are we going to move it all the way to 95%? I don't know. That's one context. The other thing that concerns me a little bit about numbers is the same misunderstanding of the 40% number that was in the old policy back several years ago, because right, if you're outside of a number, right, a little bit like graduation rate, we could get 100% graduation rate. Yeah. What's the quality of the graduate? That's not what we're interested in, right? We're not interested in a policy that dictates, you got to be at 95, and if not, we're just going to shuffle pawns. Right. Because I think the hard and fast number, the risk of that is that it becomes merely a technical solution that says I'm going to move students from A to B and B to A and take care of that. Mr. Fletcher highlighted how there are communities evolve. Nobody stays in the same house for long periods of time. I firmly believe that we have a role in that. And if we create phenomenal schools, we're going to change housing patterns. That's not going to happen tomorrow.
We've seen that.
We've seen that, right? But that's not going to happen tomorrow. But if we invest, a decade from now, we're going to create places that are phenomenal places where people are going to want to live, and I suspect we're going to be able to address some of this kind of balance. That has a different perception, I think, than just this kind of a hard and fast number. And if you go back and look at the old policy, it said if a school was out of more than 40% free and reduced lunch population, then that triggered action. But the action wasn't shuffle kids. It was look at assignment, programming, any number of factors that need to be addressed, not necessarily that just shift everything and get the numbers right, but change the underlying foundational assumptions that go into that school or setting. When I look at these maps, right, we may not be able to get full balance in the kind of short term that, and this is something I'm very passionate about and care a lot about, but I might not be able to do that. So what am I going to do? I believe I got to put opportunities out in these places because, again, it's the opportunity that a kid has access to is really what we have to be about. And we believe that there will be best opportunities if you have balanced schools. When it's out of balance, do I just shuffle or do I create opportunities? Mr. Fletcher.
I'll follow up on that, Jim. I think somehow in this conversation we've got to make sure we connect this conversation to student learning. So that is our objective, is to improve an environment for students to learn, not only academics, but social and community collaborative skills. We find that is an asset our public wants. They don't want kids who only know about themselves. They want young people who are more culturally sensitive than that. And God knows our society is telling us that is a worthy objective for us to deal with, because as adults we're not necessarily being very appreciative of differences. So I think we've got to remember that our ultimate objective is outcomes for kids, which are instructional, academic, and these companion skills that are needed. And it's difficult to make that connection sometimes when we're talking about this range. So I just want to kind of amplify on where you were going. That's got to be central to our conversation. It's about teaching and learning, and how do these strategies support that objective.
Ms. Scott and Ms. Kushner?
And adding on to what both of you have said, and I think it's important to recognize that in some of these schools, there exists a lot of opportunity already, and that since serving, and as many of you have done before me, part of that was going into these schools and seeing that for myself, and seeing, as a principal so eloquently described it, the authentic learning taking place, regardless of what test scores may say. And, these types of things are happening in these schools already, even if, their economic health index, and that's what I appreciate about the next slide, or the slide that we already passed, but, I think the marketing strategy, because I guarantee you, if someone walked into the school that I walked into today, they would have just been blown away. The first grade, writing, amazing. And if you just look at a test score and you just look at a number, you don't see that. But it's happening in those schools.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you highlighted that, because marketing, telling our story, is going to be a significant component of this work.
Absolutely.
And that's going to give the neighborhood shifts that Mr. Fletcher was talking about. Ms. Kushner.
Well, and I just wanted to piggyback on that discussion that we really need our parents to be key stakeholders, but also our community, because this is not only about opportunity, it's about mobility within our communities. It's about fairness. I think people are motivated by that idea of fairness and fair opportunity for children, most certainly. So I think we need to keep that very student-centered and balance that with the tension, the real tension we have with choice in this community that is not leading to those outcomes of fairness to kids. So how do we balance all these things together?
So I'm going to keep us moving along here. I think that this conversation is totally part of, the conversation that we'd like to have at the end about what does the communication plan look like. But just to the point of timeline and the urgency, did you have something to share?
Before you get to that, and I guess I wanted to make one more point about the range of improvement versus the hard and fast target. And that if we're at 123 schools and assuming that they would stay in place, also sort of assumes that we're sort of operating in a silo, and that we're sort of oblivious to all of the things that are going on sort of outside. And looking back at the history, one would argue, I often argue, that when we were using the old policy and maintaining a 40% cap, and we were doing that well until we started getting hit with the growth each year, 5,000, 6,000 new students a year. And it became harder, in my opinion, to maintain the focus on the socioeconomic piece because we were managing growth and managing population. And I think this would be the same if you're, to Dr. Martin's point, thinking about the history and what that tells us. If we're just focused on this certain number of schools in the range, and we're not taking into account these external forces of growth and everything else, we may find ourselves in the same place in 5, 6, 7 years that we've not allowed for or accounted for those external factors such as growth and the movement and everything else. And then all this sort of work that we're doing now becomes somewhat obsolete.
Right. I think that's really helpful. I think one of the things that we have written down for sure is that, regardless of what we think about long-term targets for those outside of the range, it seems like you all definitely want to be able to see kind of balance across all schools, right? So not just like at a certain cut point necessarily, but to think about, where all schools are in that distribution. I think we can figure out think we can come back at the next meeting and spend at least some time with data just looking specifically at that. And what I think about is some kind of dashboard to track this so you all can be aware of the distribution. But I'm just going to keep us moving along. I'm going to let Frederica talk a little bit about what we imagine as a long-term timeline for this.
So you all have already talked about revisiting our purpose. That's exactly where we were going, that this is one approach. This is one strategy towards moving towards the goal of graduating at least 95% of students ready for productive citizenship. And that's a goal that the community has said this is what we would like to see. And so reducing socioeconomic imbalance in schools is one way. And we've talked about in our sessions over the course of the year that we do want to go back and think about what are some, what's the community input plan that we want to design, how do we remove barriers, looking at academic programming, looking at marketing strategies. So these were some of the topics that you all talked about a couple of meetings ago that we need to dedicate significant time to so that we can consider what the data says, what's in the history, what are the policies that we have in place that we can think about. And this is just to re-emphasize that this is not one how, but there are many that we're going to look at to help support moving towards our goal, whether that is a range of improvement that is set by the district, and then also how do we hold ourselves accountable in doing the work. So as we look at the overall timeline, during this year, we imagine board discussion and feedback, some direction setting, some thinking about the accountability piece, definitely the community input. The same thing for the next year. We're starting to think about policies, preparing for what could be our implementation plan. And then imagine in 21-22 some of the first implementation strategies that might be taking place. So thinking about that during that time, and then ongoing implementation, accountability conversations, revisiting the data, seeing where we are, seeing what the impacts are in order to get to that 25-26 draft target that we talked about. So thinking about the long-term strategy, but having different things in place so that we can continue to revisit that as we move towards this particular target that's set.
Let me just ask Superintendent Moore, how do you see this aligning with the strategic plan work?
Well, I think there's natural alignment in the desire to continue the work that we've begun around every student every day and ensuring that we are providing opportunities for all students to be successful and that our schools are high-quality places to learn for all students. So I think there's alignment there, and it's a bigger part of the picture that being in schools that don't have overt challenges one way or another with regards to the needs of students interfere with the opportunity to learn. So. But either way, it aligns with the fact that we want all of our schools to be high-quality places for students to learn, wherever we end up. I think the review that happens around whether it's programming or assignment or other factors that impact schools and how we can support our schools where they are and kids where they are will be important to our work moving forward. And I think how we build stakeholder and community support and involvement for this will be an important part of our strategic plan as we move forward as well.
Well, just a question as we look at the demographic profile of our schools. The next slide goes on to talk about the opportunity of many strategies, magnets year-round, family supports, transportation, innovative programming, and how are those discussions done here in our work session? Is that staff doing stuff and then telling us their ideas? And how are these? Because I think most of us expect that circling neighborhoods on a map is not the only strategy we want to look at. Although it may be one. And so how do these other things get mixed into our conversation effectively?
So we talked about this particular proposed plan for our board work session and thinking about what are the topics that we want to discuss for each of those work sessions. And in addition to that, thinking about the structure of the meetings. So having time to review the previous meetings and then going in and looking at relevant data that we have that staff can bring for review. Considering any staff recommendations that may come up as they are related to the draft target. And then this was something that definitely came up in our last meeting to surface the trade-offs and possible unintended consequences, but also to think about what is currently working in terms as it relates to our goal. And then having a facilitated discussion around what does this mean for the goal that we're trying to set? What are the changes? What are the things that are being successful that we want to maintain? And then ensuring that as we continue having these conversations, we move that back to policies and practices that align to the goal. So if we're thinking about transportation and what that means, we have data, we're considering the trade-offs, we're considering what's working, how that's impacting schools, having conversations about it, and then determining what are some next steps, what are additional questions, what is additional data that we may need, or is there something that we want to focus on in terms of its relation to our draft target.
Well, and specific for before-after care.
Yeah.
How would that conversation be informed? Are we talking about only Wake County resources? Are we looking at private resources that are available in the community to provide before-after care? I mean, how is that conversation robustly informed to find something that it doesn't exist yet in terms of how do we support before-after school families?
And also after-school activities for middle school and high school. I mean, if you volunteer and go, or if you're able to get into a magnet program, you may not have access due to the bus schedule to get you home and your parents' work schedule to do any after-school activities, which can be very prohibitive for families that want to be involved in their school, but can't always provide the transportation.
I think what we've seen in terms of particularly student assignment appeal hearings has been before-after care is absolutely essential for folks who are going to work at 5 o'clock in the morning and then working a second job.
Exactly.
Yep.
So how is my child being cared for when they're not in the academic day? Those kinds of things, that is driving a lot of concentrations of folks of less means.
Yeah, I think that's one of the original versions of this timeline that we had. We got feedback from staff, particularly around that, saying that was one of the first things that we would take on in October. So I think what we'd like to do there is because, I think one of the big challenges of this is that, the data you all need to inform what you do is so big and so has so many different fields, right? And so I think what we imagine doing with the help of the staff is to give you a data packet prior to the October meeting that lets you think about before and after care, intercession, and those things, and dig into that. And at the end of that meeting, have a running list of kind of policy next steps or practice next steps that we'd imagine as we get to the spring, summer 2020 area where we start to think about what does it actually mean for policy and practice. So we imagine that kind of each of those chunks taking place and having data for you all to reflect on. But that what you just described, I think, was one of the things that we heard as something we need to take on early.
And I think another thing is we ask for your recommendations about what data you would like to see. So if you have recommendations on before and after care or other barriers that you see to meeting our goal that you want to recommend we seek out data on, if that's possible, if it's feasible to grab data on that, then that would be something that we would love for you to write down on your sheet so that we have that information, and then we can go out and see what we can do.
So we're not making decisions based on anecdotes.
That's right.
We get in our appeals, but some real data.
Can I offer?
Well, again, some of it may have. a particular service may not exist.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, one time we didn't have intercession camps anywhere.
I was trying to.
And the community wasn't providing intercession from what we tried to
We're just doing the southern part.
To build off Mr. Fletcher's comment about, things that don't exist, I'd encourage us to think, it's a language issue, but let's not just think about barriers with respect to access, but let's think about opportunities for a next generation of education. As I shared in my State of Schools address, in responding to some question and answer with the folks at the Chamber, a lot of people like to argue that the 20th century picture of the classroom, which is so backward, is desks in rows. Well, I can teach in desks in rows, and I can teach in a very modern way, even with desks in rows. But where I see the 20th century model of education is our system is designed for there being a stay-home parent. One parent is supposed to take care of transportation and whatnot. That's why you can start school at 9:15 and end school at 3:30. There's no employment that works that way. So how do we, yes, it removes barriers, but how do we maybe rethink education that aligns with modern reality? The modern reality where you've got two working parents. The modern reality where, you can't wait till a 9:15 start and a 3:30 end is just not going to work. If those are just barriers, it's not going to have the same system change that if we think about what would a modern education system look like? I don't know what the answer is, but I know it wouldn't look like what we've currently got. So maybe we can put the two pieces together, and some of the schools where we have the greatest challenge, maybe we start by piloting. This is what a new school would look like. And all of a sudden, that's going to be an attractive place for me to want to be. And to Mr. Fletcher's earlier comment, maybe I'm going to move there. That's, again, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but now I'm looking at the 10, 20-year outlook. Opportunity, not just barrier.
So we wanted to, let's spend the last couple of minutes that we have today and talk about the stakeholder and communities input and having that front and center. I'm going to turn it back over to.
Sure. So I think we actually really started to touch on this in our conversation a little bit, but one of the things we wanted to spend, so at the second meeting we talked about who, from a stakeholder perspective, you all wanted to reach out to, and we have a good draft list of that. It's a pretty broad and diverse list, and it's, I think, a great starting point for who we reach out to. But I think at the last meeting, too, we talked about, okay, but what do we want to ask, right? So what, and I think this gets to, we had the conversation about the target last time, and we said, I sensed some discomfort about, well, we don't want to set the target without getting feedback. So we changed the language to think about, okay, and we're very clear about the timeline that this is a draft target for feedback. So what we wanted to talk about were 3 key ideas. And what I'll do is I'll just talk through kind of some of the things that we're thinking, and then I'll get to the last slide, and Frederica is going to take notes, and I will take notes. But one of the deliverables in October is the staff coming back with a communication plan. And so we thought the things that mattered are, what are the key questions that we want to ask? And so we thought of some example questions, right? How will X policy or practice affect your child and family? Kind of these sort of key questions that as we think about this policy, right? And to the chair's larger point about what we want schools to be, what are the key questions that we want to ask through the feedback process? Secondly, how do we want to ask this? Town halls, community meetings, there's so much value in face-to-face. There's also a lot of value in written feedback, focus groups. How do we want to do this? So we wanted to kind of talk about the means to communicate and get feedback. And lastly, this point was made, and I think continues to be made, is what are the messages? Like, why are we doing this? And I feel like if there's anything in this room that I feel 100% clear about, is that the policy around socioeconomic imbalance is not about that alone for this board. I hear that 100%. I hear that this is about students. It's about bullet number 3, productive citizenship for all the students in this county. And so I think I want to talk about, like, what are the messages that we want to be sending? Because the corollary to that is, I think that you all have decided that socioeconomic balance is part of that solution, right? And so so some of the big ideas that we came across is SES imbalance is part of a larger strategy. And, the fifth bullet, research tells us that balanced and diverse schools can benefit student learning in the long term, right? So as you think about those 3 ideas, key questions, how the community is involved, and the messages that you want to be sent, what are some of the things that you want to see in the staff plan in October for each of these 3 big categories?
Ms. Scott, Ms. Mahat?
In terms of the means, I decided to say hello to the schools in Zebulon today and then drove here after. It's a solid 35-plus minute drive with no traffic whatsoever. So I think in some of our communities that either it's because they're geographically far away, but I think we really have to acknowledge the barriers that I know some board members have brought up again and again that are in place to be able to communicate with communities, that we really look into creative ways into reaching those, even if it means talking to some churches or sporting events, some of the things that Anika had forwarded on in an email. I don't know if that maybe you would want to forward that email on,
I could forward it.
so that could be shared. But there was a community member who said, "Hey, we want to give feedback, but if you aren't here, and if you're only allowing for written feedback, and not everybody who wants to share feedback can write, or we really need to avoid ableism in that way."
Awesome.
Ms. Mahaffey?
I think absolutely everything Ms. Scott said, of making sure that we are geographically out there at different events. For the last bullet, sure, research tells us balanced, diverse schools can benefit student learning and long-term outcomes, but we really have to share the why and what that means. Does it help us, financially to have, for taxpayers to have balanced schools? Does it, what do we put into our schools? What kind of benefits does the research show? Because, we might have folks who are educators who are very familiar with that, and other folks who are just saying, oh, well, you say research says, what does that mean? And we have to share really what that is and spell it out. And I know this is just listed under the example of a key question, but if we don't know what the policy or practice is yet written out, we really can't ask stakeholders to say how it will impact their family, because we're asking them to fill in the blanks of what we're meaning. So, asking them, what are the barriers? Does your child attend their base school? Why, what was your reason for choosing that? Did you look into other options? Why did you pursue those? Why did you choose not to pursue those? And really finding, because we're going to see from parents and members of the community what those barriers are that we may not have thought of at this table.
Yep.
I would also like to let us as a board maybe talk a little about stability of children traveling together from elementary all the way to high school. I guess for 30 years, more than that even, I felt like the relationships my children formed in diverse populations at elementary and magnet schools, and they had the ability, therefore, in a magnet program to travel all the way through high school, were the best relationships they had. So I think when we maybe talk about stability for our kids in the county, that if they travel with the relationships that they build at a young age in a diverse population, it'll serve them well in high school.
So how do you do that systemically would be the question.
That'll be the question, yeah. We do it in the magnets pretty well, but we're going to have to figure out elsewise.
And we started looking at that in the assignment plan since I've been on the board. Feeder patterns, but not,
We've always kind of looked at
as a system.
But when we start diversifying more, we're going to have to really be cognizant of that.
Right, I mean, that gets back to our choice with purpose, right? That's the stability is the value of the choice. The purpose is the what does it do to help us? So we can offer stability, and we need you to help with this.
Well, it's also their social support. I mean, to Roxy's point, I mean, it's not just us, but the benefit, which we hear that all the time from parents. And I think we should take that on and not dismiss it, especially in the climate that our children are living in.
I don't have family in this area, but I have this core group of friends that can help out because we've been
back to Dr. Martin's point, right? Not only is it designed for a stay-at-home parent, but it's designed for, if I grew up in Thomasville, everybody could take care of me. That doesn't exist for my daughter, right? And so that is no longer, and it's also not the environment we live in Wake County either anymore. So that's another factor of, I think this board saying we are aware of the ever-changing demographics and the movement, but also of what family looks like and how people define that and their support systems.
Communities in our schools to go for a while.
And it makes us a part of building community, which we all recognize is becoming a thing of the past if we don't build it.
Well, that gets back to the means. So often when we seek input, we get input from the willing. And I think we need to be
really
more
intentional
in the input from those who aren't comfortable coming out. So we have to be much more intentional about
My
getting
note
input
says
from
meet
places that don't
them where they
otherwise.
are, living room chats. That's my note for us next time. Is a barrier.
That's what we're saying has to happen in the classroom.
Yes.
The child doesn't want to participate. It's an overt effort to build a relationship with the non-participant so that they become a participant and willingly participate in their own learning. I mean, it's the same issue with community engagement.
But I don't think we've said it that way that clearly, and I feel like that's where we're circling the wagon right now.
Yeah. What about, I think one of the things that I'm cognizant of is, messages about purpose, but also about process. Because I think that's like a big part from the last meeting. That's why we did the sort of longer term timelines to give the community a sense in this document and others about, how quickly decisions like this would happen. So what messages about the process would you like to see in that plan?
Well, I'm hoping we have multi-layered ways of reaching folks in a very proactive way, as Ms. Johnson-Hosler said, and it needs to be layered. We might hit one family or a community member 3 or 4 times in different ways, and we might want them to do an online survey and come to a town hall and be part of a focus group, just so we can get a robust representation of what is the desire of our community on their schools.
Mr. Sutton and Ms. Matthew?
In terms of this, there's a, Ms. Johnson just kind of touched on it, but I think there's a key message that would almost serve as some sort of preamble to the conversation, if you will, and that is the role of the school system in building community. And we're sort of taking a lead in that, and then of course the biggest example right now is Southeast Raleigh Elementary. That's right. And our foray, if you will, into community economic development. because that was a huge role and something that was very different than what we've done in the past. And it was talked about at the ribbon cutting about how we have played a role in building that part of the community and making an investment in the community, and so on and so forth. And so there's a role that we're playing, and we were in a meeting with the leadership the other day, and I think the county commissioners asked what role they could play in helping us do this work, particularly around the social and economic balance piece. And I think it would be incumbent on all of us as governmental, quasi-governmental agencies to articulate what is our role, what is our role in building community, because it's a different role, it's a different space, particularly as we're leading that work and leading that conversation with regard to schools, our role in building community and how we're using, to your point, I think, how we're using school buildings to shape communities, to build prosperity in communities, to build economic opportunity in communities. And so there's a role, there's a new era, I think, that we're sort of embarking upon in the system and government playing a role in community building.
Ms. Mack.
I'm just thinking about, since we've implemented more of our, family and community engagement plan in our strategic plan, I've noticed for, the duration my kids have been in school of, well, come tonight and we'll teach you about, our reading program. And now it's more and more across our schools, we're seeing, well, come to the school, we'll have some childcare provided, and you'll be able to learn about this, and there will be either, pizza slices for $1, or one of our partners has donated, a number of meals from a local restaurant. But that sort of thing, to bring people in, because if I have 3 kids and my husband's not home, I'm not taking them unless there's childcare provided. And they need to be fed, because usually it's at night or during the weekend. And it's really an opportunity to educate as well. So can we bring in before and after care folks to help remove barriers, track out camp info, targeted year-round and magnet information, and working with our county and municipal partners on any other soft services in the area, like from Health and Human Services or ways that families can learn about opportunities, not just within our district, but so they can learn, because this is a community-wide effort. So we need to make sure that we're finding ways to bring the community in, not just to get their feedback, but to show them what is there for them. Because I think we hear from a lot of families, oh my gosh, you put me in this school or this calendar, and it's not familiar to me, I don't know what to do. And so we have to show what opportunities are currently available, and not just learning what those barriers are.
Ms. Cash, Ms. Johnson?
I for one, want to hear how our chambers and our municipalities are going to work and help us make this work. I spend a lot of time having people come up to me at chamber meetings going, when are we going to get back? We want to get back to the way the community was. We want to get our diversity pieces. Well, I want our chambers to do their part in this, because that communication is going to be key to the business leaders and to the people with businesses, all the way down to small businesses.
Business leadership is essential in being successful.
Business leadership and local government.
So I think that was a great lead-in, which we did not plan it this time. Last time we did. This time we did not. I gave her the last comment, which is part of the messaging to me, and I think it goes with both Ms. Casha and Ms. Mahaffey. This messaging also has to be that it's bigger than Wake County. So if we're bringing in, the local I don't know, coffee shop to provide pastries, then they're bringing their clientele with them into our buildings, and I think that has to be the message. If we're bringing the Y or whoever it is, Boys and Girls Club, their clientele should be coming with them. That has to be a part of the conversation. We cannot do it by ourselves, and I think we have to tell people we don't want to do it by ourselves anymore. Because people feel like we've been doing it by ourselves, and we want to do that. And so I think however we relay the messaging just isn't to parents, it is to our community at large. Because, like it or not, 70% of them have children. Also, they're reading our stuff anyway, even if they don't have kids, because the school district is an economic engine. And if we're trying to operate in a silo, which people feel like we have been, then that messaging has to be clear to them as well. So however we frame it, it also has to be we're asking the community to come and we're going to meet them, and vice versa, because people don't really believe when you say, no, we're going to get together. No, we should be honest. We're going to ask you to come to us sometimes to our parent engagement nights, and sometimes we're going to come to you. And I think people will appreciate the transparency, because if we just say, oh yeah, we're going to all work together, nobody believes that, because you don't lay out a way to do that. So I think you have to build the trust first by saying we're going to have some real back and forth in the ways that we begin a new relationship together. And I think parents who don't fully engage in our feedback or messaging, it's because they don't see themselves in it.
Good point.
They feel like we're just telling them what to do and moving their kids. And we need to be writing this in a way that everybody sees themselves in whatever we're relaying. So yes, I expect the local bakery to give pastries, right? Like, let's just be clear. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm also saying that I expect if there's a Y program in one of our schools, that we're going to go with the Y to where those kids live, because those families need to know if we're going to be opening more before and after care, whatever that looks like, that we're trusting their kids to be in our buildings for this long. If we're going to put them back on an activity bus, I have a kid in high school. She has a 2-hour gap between activity and school ending. Well, luckily, I can text somebody to pick her up. Not everybody has that, so their kid can't participate if there's a 2-hour gap between 2:20 and 4:20 of an activity starting. We have to be able to build our trust.
So this is great. So I think that's a ton of great feedback. I think just to kind of,
On my list,
there we go. Just to reference I wanted to make a quick reference back to our timeline. So I think coming out of this, I think at our October meeting, so we'll have basically a month between now and then, it seems to me I'm leaving with this thinking that we will devote at least some period of time, probably 10 or 15 minutes, to making sure that we've thought about how we could present the data from a kind of incremental growth perspective as well. So how that would look over time. I've heard also a simple explanation of the percentile distribution, and I think I have some ideas, and we'll work with staff to figure out how we could kind of lay that out so that as a sort of sample for what it would look like to communicate to parents. And then the second thing I think is to come back with a draft plan for how communication would happen, that green bar. So stakeholder involvement plan would come back in October. And then I think we're going to dig into the data on barriers to service. So before and after care, intercession, that will be our first major kind of conversation about what policy changes might happen. So that will be a busy meeting in October. Is there anything else coming out of today that is burning on your mind that you want to make sure that we are covering in October or throughout the rest of this plan?
I'm glad it's you leading us.
Great. Okay, so what I'd ask you to do is just make sure that you capture any feedback, parking lot items on this yellow paper. And we will be back here in a month with plans. We'll send the data in advance per usual, and we can look forward to actually digging into some of the policy and practice changes you mentioned.
Sorry, I'm kidding.
Thank you all for good and robust discussion. This is absolutely continuing work.
It's a secret ballot.
It won't be secret when they see this horrible handwriting.
Well, when they call me to ask me to interpret it.
That's right. They'll know. Trust me. Exactly. They're going to need some interpreting on mine. That's why I tried to say most of what I wrote, so they could guess.
All right, so based on our agenda, we were going to go till 4:30, but Drew, is your group here?
Yes, sir.
Like it.
As I walk up to the table, I'm assuming we're going to the end.
I'm assuming that as well. You were coming to the table. Just want to make sure your team is here.
That would be don't jinx us.
Yeah.
That's true.
Don't say that.
That's true. Good point. Good point.
The last time that was said, we talked about.
I know, we needed to chastise Chris for that.
Oh, no.
I did. I thought of a note as I was looking at the things.
It's okay.
Pass it down. Came home with Catherine. What's your paper budget?
Oh, is it heavy?
Yeah.
He had some leftover from when he was at Garner. Oh, is it him?
Well, then I like it. Yeah. I want like 1 paper.
I mean, this is really good paper, though. Seriously.
Right. Thank you both. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just give a second for a couple board members to come back. Let's go get started.
Ready?
We're ready.
Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Many of you may recall back in, I believe, April of 2019, Ms. Roberts and myself provided you with an overview and an update on AIG programming in the Wake County Public School System. Today, we're excited to be here to provide you with an overview of our 2019-2022 AIG plan. Recognizing that time is short, we'll do our best to hit the most significant highlights, but also provide you with enough information and detail so that you can engage in some discussion and provide some feedback. As we get started, I see several of you flipping through the handout that we just passed around. In addition to the PowerPoint presentation, you do have a handout. It's got kind of a summary of data and information on one side. There's also a note catcher tool on the back that you can use just to record some notes and also record some questions that you may decide to ask at the end of the presentation. So use that to the degree that you feel appropriate. That's also in your electronic material as well. You also in Assembly have access to the full draft plan itself, so certainly reference that as needed throughout the conversation today. So just for some background and context information, as you may know, North Carolina state statute does require LEAs to develop a 3-year AIG local plan. There's some very specific components that legislation requires that we'll kind of outline for you today. The legislation also mandates identification and services for gifted education for K-12 students. The plan must be approved by the local board and then submitted to DPI and the State Board of Education. Just some quick notes. First of all, it is worth noting that the process that was used to develop the plan that you see today has truly been collaborative and multi-phased over many, many months of time and effort. Many of those folks are in the room with us today that contributed, including staff from academics, data research, accountability, student support services, school-based staff, including principals and AIG teachers as well. At this point, as you see, and I know we engaged in some discussion just a few minutes ago around core beliefs, I think we'd all expect that we would be aligning our work to the 2020 strategic plan, and that's no different in this case. I do think it's important to point out, when you look at beliefs 1, 2, and 4, these were particularly important considerations for staff as they were drafting the AIG plan, and we feel like that in many ways this really does support the why of the work that we'll be sharing with you today. So hopefully you'll see evidence of these core beliefs throughout today's presentation, but also manifest in the plan itself. So as we move into the review of the plan, this slide provides you just with a quick overview and give you an idea of the numbers of students in the Wake County Public School System that are identified as AIG as of the 2018-19 school year. We have just over 26,000 of our students, which by my math out of 160,000 is about 16.5%. As we know, and as you can see on the data table in the handout that you have, we recognize that we do have ongoing challenges with gaps in identification. And in the chart that you see there in the overview, it shows the percentage of each racial subgroup that is identified as AIG, which clearly indicates gaps. So for example, you can see that the percentage of white and Asian students that are identified as AIG is significantly higher than the identification rate for Black and Hispanic students. So in our view, again, these data points clearly reinforce the why behind our work and the critical significance of those core beliefs that we tie our work back to. So there's no doubt that much work must and can be done to address these gaps, while also ensuring that we're providing services to students in a way that differentiates instruction and really challenges them the way that they need to be challenged. So at this time, to kind of outline an overview of what that looks like, I'm going to turn it over to Lakeisha Roberts, who will take you through an overview of the plan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I have the honor of going through the AIG plan and just highlighting some of the components that have been changed throughout the plan. But before I go through, if you notice throughout the slide, it's broken out into 6 standards. And so those are the 6 standards provided by the state that guide the AIG program. And each of those standards, we're expected to write to that plan. And then the whole plan would be a comprehensive program for our advanced learners. So if you notice, what we'll do is we'll go through each standard and then just highlight some of the changes or the things that we wanted to make sure we bring focus to. So with Standard 1, one of the biggest changes that we went through with Standard 1 is eliminating the word gateway and changing it to gifted identification opportunities. The second change was we originally had 6 gateways, so they were gateways, ways that students were identified as gifted, and we have condensed them to 3 concise gifted opportunities for students, and infusing some of the reciprocity and the other components of the plan within the body of the plan. And then the third major piece of Standard 1 is schools are now going to be asked to have K2 lists to monitor giftedness of K2 students. And opposed to just having a gifted program, what we're doing is making sure that we are keeping our pulse on those K2 students to help develop some of those gifts and talents in our students at an early age. Now, as mentioned by Mr. Cook, aligning our practices to core beliefs, our next phase of Standard 1 aligns to core belief 2, which is to eliminate the ability to predict achievement based on socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity. So this team collaborated with Student Information Services and Student Assignment to review some local data and being able to provide that data to schools so schools could make school-based decisions based on the individual needs of their students. So now they have the ability to sit down with teams and make decisions that are good for their students, of course, with some district guidance. Standard 2 is comprehensive programming. And so based on the information we learned from the Nurturing for a Bright Tomorrow, which was a part of the Javits grant for our 16 targeted schools, there were some higher level thinking skills that were incorporated in some of those lessons. And so what we did is we pulled out some of those higher level thinking skills and partnered with the science department. And now those thinking skills are evident in all of the science lessons that all K-2 students in Wake County Public Schools will be exposed to. So not only is that beneficial for our K-2 students as far as nurturing is concerned, now we can make sure that all students get that exposure. The other highlight for Standard 2 is what we're calling talent development. And essentially, that's just nurturing for 4th through 5th grade students this year. So really kind of looking at our students who have gifted potential but just need some grooming in that and giving them the opportunity to be exposed to some of those higher level thinking skills and project-based approaches that some of our AIG students would be exposed to, and then giving them an opportunity to be renominated when we feel like we've gotten an opportunity to develop some of those skills. The other exciting part of Standard 2 is that we're going to be introducing what we're calling a transition plan. And so a transition plan would be for all our 5th and 8th grade students. So essentially what we would do is map out a trajectory of advanced level placement based on students' interests and how they perform. So for example, a 5th grader would leave 5th grade with a projected trajectory of what their middle school potentially could look like, offering of compacted classes and that type of thing. And then when you leave out of 8th grade, you would leave with a proposed trajectory for high school. And so really encouraging students to pursue some of those advanced level placement classes.
But that's not the only way to get, certainly I would hope, high school advanced placement classes.
I'm sorry?
Having that transition from 8th grade, that's not the only way to access.
No, it wouldn't be. What we're trying to do is to make sure that our AIG students, when they leave the middle school setting, that they are exposed to some of the courseworks that are available. So at least when they leave, based on their interests and how they perform, we can make some recommendations of some advanced level classes that they may not have thought of pursuing.
They stay on that trajectory. Thank you.
Does that accountability fall onto the leaving grade people, the 8th grade? The 8th grade teachers and staff more than on the high school?
Actually, I think it's both. It's a mutual accountability. And I think just as the case is with honors level course placements, and we've got criteria that we use to identify students, for example, if they have an A or a B and a level 3 or above on an 8th grade reading EOG, we would expect those kids to find their way to a 9th grade honors level course. And so what we ask is that middle schools are very intentional and conscientious on the way out the door in checking and rechecking course schedules, for example, for their students that are exiting. But we also ask for the same thing to be done in return for those 9th grade high school principals and staff to be reviewing their kids to make sure they're properly placed. So to answer your question, it's a mutual
I'm sorry, go ahead. That pretty much falls on counselors, right? And I know it does in high school, that the counselors get a lot of that scheduling that hits them. Is that what happens, like people that are talking to each other?
So it would be a collaboration between those, but it would primarily be the AIG teacher that would have this kind of, it would just be a paperwork that kind of says, based on how you perform, here are some classes that might be of interest to you as you pursue your high school career. And so we would work with counseling and whoever is responsible for scheduling to make sure that students are placed in that. But that was our first attempt to make sure that we're having a high school presence and trying to gear students toward those advanced level classes.
So we, as the AIG people,
yes.
Is there one? There's not one in every middle school.
Yes.
There is one in every middle school. Okay.
At 50%? Or
I didn't hear you.
At full-time or 50%?
It's based on their numbers.
Oh, yeah, then that's not, to me, that's not like one in every middle school. That's like...
It's a team effort, but I think it's fair to say certainly and the counselor certainly is going to be a point person in making sure course placements are appropriate.
I could put it on my note catch, but now that I have the floor, so I'm curious about those kids who, like, especially our transition kids, if they're transitioning 8th to 9th, but they haven't been identified. I mean, it could be because EAG score, it could be anything, whatever it is we're looking for, but they haven't been identified, then that does rest on the counselor 100%, I'm assuming, or the teacher.
For students that are not identified as, and I don't know what
So
that
when we're talking about like this transition grade.
Right, so this is primarily for identified students because the plan is targeting them. And so when we're looking at our advanced learners, we're trying to make sure that we have our AIG students, but of course it would be a great plan for other students too.
So then I have to keep asking us, then we're not going to increase the number of kids of color if we're only doing that for AIG students. I mean, I don't see how that's going to be a pathway to increase that number.
So one of the things we're trying to do and to increase that number is what we're calling talent development. So getting a little bit deeper into talent development, starting with 4-5, and then in the plan we have a proposed plan as far as moving forward with that. So we're starting with 4-5, but really what it is students are recommended based on a criteria. And then sometimes those students don't meet a criteria. There might be off by a couple of points or something. One of the things we want to do is to make sure that if those students had gifts and talents that we felt like was worthy to look at, that we don't just say, sorry kids, you don't qualify, but we provide an opportunity to develop some of those critical thinking skills in those students and then renominate them with the hopes that when we renominate after having exposure, because some of these things need to be taught and exposed to, then we would increase the number of students in our underrepresented populations. In some of our schools, we have high numbers of identified AIG students, and in some schools we have low numbers of identified students. But in our lower numbers of identified students, they'd have a bigger pool of talent development, so giving students opportunity to have exposure to some of that thinking with the hopes of translating to higher number of identified students.
Yeah, I did put this on my note catcher when we talked about talent development. For me, which I like that this is a part of the plan, my concern is we can expose them to those things during the school day, but if there is no opportunity for that exposure to continue at home, then I can guarantee you we're not going to see the growth in the school building, right? Because we all know that for a kid, any kid, right, who's at potential but not already identified, if we're not fostering that, which we don't have the ability to foster outside of that school today, which is what we just talked about earlier for me, is that's my concern is, are they ever going to meet the benchmark? That's what my question is here. How can they really ever meet the benchmark to be identified? I'm just curious if you've thought about this. Like, if we're talent developing in the school day, then what do we foresee to be the thing to carry that kid to the benchmark later? Or are we just going to talent develop them through K-12?
Well, I know we have schools where 4th and 5th grade is done not necessarily by homogenous grouping, but that already identified AIG kids are in a class, and then every child
That's why I'm asking this question.
Right. But I'm saying, like, this is a pilot program that we can potentially look at where AIG is an elective, so everybody gets exposure. Those kids that are already identified have, access to their programming, but it allows that potential talent development. Granted, it's only one day a week, but with AIG only being funded at 14%.
That's still not what I'm really saying.
4%, sorry. Yeah. No, I had 4% written down.
That's still not what I'm saying. I guess I'm asking you if we have a new growing potential up here, and we're approving this as a part of our plan, then I'm not asking that question. I'm asking, what is your plan for benchmarking?
I think there's a growing potential in that, and
that's
so
what I'm asking.
One of the things that we wanted to look at is first, so even with 4th and 5th grade being talent development, our goal would be to move that on to upper grades, move that into our middle schools, but with this 3-year plan, our proposal is to start off with 4-5.
Right.
Of course, there's a lot of growth potential in that, and some of that is standard 5, which deals with partnerships.
Yep.
A lot of our schools have some of those partnerships already, but making sure that we kind of strengthen some of those partnerships. But with this plan, as far as looking at talent development, we kind of started small, and we're starting with 4-5 so that we can kind of develop that and think about moving forward.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So we do need to continue on this, but to the point, I heard you note that we often will place the AIG based on the number of MOE for the AIG person based on the number identified.
Yes.
But we may need to flip that a little bit, because if you don't have a lot identified, you actually may need more effort in terms of MOE than just because you had it identified?
I think it's both.
It's both. It's both.
That's really what I'm trying to figure out.
It's both, but later on, we need to look at our budget and see what percent of local funding we're putting to AIG, because that may be our bigger problem.
I think that's the challenge, is making those dollars stretch to meet both of the needs that you just described.
Because that was, as I was reading over all of this last night, that was one of my biggest questions was, I'm so glad to see we're looking to identify students who have not been identified, who should have been. But at that same time, where are there going to be seats for them? Is there going to be funding for the additional teachers?
More identification, less.
So if we're looking at our current model, there is. And so we are also looking at, if you look at Standard 6, which is talking about program accountability, we're looking at for the AIG Equity Collaborative Team to develop a logic model to be able to logically kind of roll out what this would look like. And some of our lower identified students, we do have room to be able to bring in some of those talent development students without greatly impacting the month of
Tell us about that. So the equity team is working on, I'm sorry, can you repeat the equity team is going to specifically look at strategies?
Yeah, so in Standard 6, which is program accountability.
We're just going all over the place. I'm so sorry.
We got to know.
It's better if I don't read ahead, but now I did read ahead, so I have a question.
Yes,
Because we're going
I'll
to get through
save
the
it.
various
Okay, I'll
standards, so
stop.
we got to know.
But we do want to come back to this.
Do not disagree at all. I'm just saying,
Yes.
let's look what you have prepared, and then we'll.
You're keeping up
have
with
broader
this way too well. That's your problem.
Say it again.
You're keeping up with this and very well.
Keep us on track. Keep us on track.
If you ask the questions, we're going to do our best.
Yeah, thank you for
That's
that.
my job is to try to corral us, and let's move a little bit. We'll come back to a lot of this conversation because we need to have it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So the last part is Standard 2 is site-based teams. So having teams make sure that they're looking at data to make sure that data is informing what we need for our AIG students. And Standard 3, the highlight again is making sure that there's a collaboration between the AIG teacher and the classroom teacher, because as we know, AIG students are AIG all day, every day. And so making sure that our classroom teachers have the resources in order to provide the level of instruction when students are not with the AIG teacher. And making sure that those are also aligned to North Carolina standards. In Standard 4, it's personnel and professional development. So with all of that, we want to make sure that we're providing supports for our AIG teachers. So Advanced Learning Services has committed to making sure that we have new teacher institutes for our newer AIG teachers. We have Q&A sessions for our AIG teachers. Sometimes you just have a question that you need answered, and we have a scheduled time for that. We have virtual conferencing. Our Advanced Learning Services team makes school visits. We have regional meetings, which are smaller meetings, but they're more like work sessions, so AIG teachers can kind of collaborate with each other, and then other professional learning opportunities, as well as making sure that they have access to quality resources to be able to utilize within the classrooms and in the building. And Standard 5, we talked a little bit about partnerships, and as I mentioned before, many of the schools have some really great partnerships to advance their programming, but one of the things we want to make sure in this plan is to modify our family guide, and so making sure that this guide is something that is user-friendly for all of our families and stakeholders. It tells you a little bit about the AIG program and how you can support your AIG students in school and outside of school. And then finally, I think we had mentioned before, is program accountability. So all of these are great plans, but we want to make sure that we are living up to these plans because we feel like it's great for students. So the AIG Equity Collaborative Team, and that's some of the people that are sitting here that gave many hours to write this plan, will continue to meet on a monthly basis to monitor the fidelity of the program and make sure that what we're saying we're going to do is being done and make sure it's having an impact on the students that we serve. So that was an overview of the 2019-22 AIG proposed plan. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Cook for any questions.
So we're just going to share real quickly, just for context. You see a little bit of the review process that's been undertaken, and this is just a small sampling of the work that's been done just in the last 6 weeks or so. And just as kind of a reminder, for our primary intent here today is to, of course, engage in discussion, answer questions, but also just as significantly get your feedback and input on any revisions, additions that we might make to the plan itself, with the intent and the hope to bring it back for board approval in our next board meeting, September the 17th. So we weren't that far away from the question part at the very end. So we're happy at this point to answer whatever questions that we can that you may have.
Mr. Sutton, Mr. Fletcher, Ms. Mapp. A couple of questions right quick. On standard one, the student identification piece, would it make sense or be helpful to, I guess, sort of go a little bit deeper in terms of, I guess, both the watch list and then thinking about your underrepresented groups, and that, well, I guess I'm making a suggestion of creating a watch list of students in underrepresented groups. So not just having sort of a watch list of students.
Yes.
But if you got a watch list of students in the underrepresented groups, then you're helping to, again, sort of create a larger pool, I think, of identifying or pre-identifying students with potential.
Yes, sir. And so one of the things I didn't highlight, and I apologize, in Standard 1 is that's exactly what we're going to do at the district level. So each summer, and when I mentioned the partnership with the SIS team and student assignment, what our team is going to do is kind of look at the data and look at that local data and see which students are kind of leaning to the top based on the populations that are in their schools, and then provide those lists to schools so that they can have conversations as to how to best meet them. So sometimes that might not be your traditional score, but it might be that that student is performing higher than their peers, and so might need something different than what's being offered in the standard classroom. But then that gives the site-based team an opportunity to see that data and also to analyze other portions of how that student performs in order to make sure that we're being strategic about how we provide instruction to them.
Second question, and I think I saw on the slide it mentioned nurturing giftedness specifically in science.
Yes.
Was it?
K2 science lessons.
And how might we both identify activities that help nurture giftedness and then do that across disciplines, not just in. So how do you help teachers kind of, with activities that, for example, when I was in kindergarten myself, one of the things that was very helpful to me, I think, gave a lot of confidence in me as a kindergarten and then you hear a lot of student parents say, well, my child's reading early.
Right.
So I was reading early, and my teacher would actually put me up front and let me read to the other students.
Yes.
Now, that might be a small thing, but
builds confidence.
It did a ton in terms of building confidence and my ability to read and that sort of thing. So just small things like that don't cost any money or anything, but gives teachers ideas about how to identify giftedness, be it in science or in math or in reading or what have you.
Okay.
And then my third question, and I'll stop. How have we engaged student voice in finding out what works in terms of both identification and nurturing giftedness, particularly in talking to, again, students in those underrepresented groups? Have we had any input from students themselves on what would be helpful to you?
Nope, we have not, but I think that's a wonderful idea.
Mr. Fletcher?
I'm not trained as an educator, so my questions may seem strange. One of the things that was exciting about the new EL curriculum is that in every class, grade level coursework is used, regardless of the student's reading ability. I think that's being an effective strategy. my concern looking at this, and I realize that what you're responding to here is what the state requirement is. So my questions are broader. What can we do K-3? Kids don't just switch on at 9 years of old and giftedness show up. What can we do at K-3 to, I'm wondering, is vocabulary a driving factor in whether the child demonstrates giftedness? Is hands-on project work? Is collaborative problem solving? I mean, where are the opportunities for a child without a strong vocabulary, without reading as a first grader, okay, to demonstrate the fact that there's giftedness in another domain that we can nurture? So what do we do there in this K-1? If we wait until 4th grade, I'm sorry, the kids are setting a whole lot of their habits have been set based on what level of expectation has been set for them within the school setting.
Absolutely right.
So, thank you. I appreciate that. That's what I'm trying to understand is how if we break this cycle where kids aren't demonstrating enough for us to identify them, what can we do K-3 to change this outcome?
Well, so I think one generic response, Mr. Fletcher, and it goes back to what you were just saying, the number one thing that I think that we can do is have an engaging, rigorous curriculum that's relevant to all the students in the classroom, that inspires and provokes some level of interest and passion
Absolutely.
that maybe otherwise wouldn't be present. And so I think that goes back to the point that you were making. I think that's probably number one and the most systemically impactful thing that we can do.
So are you saying, Mr. Cook, that for 30% of our population, our curriculum is not that?
I'm saying we've got work to do in that realm at that particular grade span.
Okay.
And I think Lakeisha probably can share a couple of other examples of the types of things that we might look for, particularly in regards to that K2 group that you were just describing.
So in K2 or even K3, like you're speaking of, not just the science lessons, but some teachers also utilize, and some of the teachers in here probably can speak a little bit better to that, is they utilize the PETS program, which kind of gives kids an opportunity to kind of explore that non-academic but critical thinking components of their brain. There are inventories that teachers participate in, trying to look for some of those characteristics that they see in students. And then the piece that we're adding on top of it is that really taking the time to actually look at how students are performing and seeing in what areas are they performing a little bit higher. Is this student a stronger writer? Is this student stronger in social studies? And then having those intentional conversations during PLTs or during the school-based committee that looks at gifted students to be more intentional. That's what we mean by having that list of students and being more intentional about how we're targeting them so that when we are ready to identify, we know what areas that they need nurturing.
Go back to just ask one follow-up question.
Yes.
In the terms of vocabulary, on a scale of 1 to 10, how does a student's vocabulary correlate to their likelihood of being identified? And that's not a 1 to 10 question.
Yeah, right. I think I understand your question. I don't know if I know the answer to that.
Because the absence of vocabulary is fundamental when children aren't read to birth to K, when they don't have books in the home, when parents are stretched so thin in their time that they don't have the time to nurture a child reading. It's a fundamental issue that when we got folks in the community who are working on this,
Yes.
but it's a fundamental issue, and parents just understood how important vocabulary, kids hearing words is. Okay, I'll leave my soapbox.
So I'm going to add to my soapbox, which I was not going to do. But to Mr. Fletcher's point, I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say vocabulary probably at a 10, but that's just my non-educated personal guess. So we can just leave that where it's worth not even 2 cents. But I guess the thing that I've heard parents say to me, and these are parents who don't understand the school system, right? And AIG was not their end goal. But for me, when I hear parents say to me, my kid went to school excited about school, had good habits at school, it was immediately crushed him. Because, we teach them very early, she's smart, you're not. And not by what we say, but by the way that we display for a kid who has less vocabulary, but may have very strong critical thinking skills. So that's why I was trying to dig into what does this watch list look like and how are we really going to foster that for kids or families who don't have the ability to say, nope, I didn't read to my kid because I have 2 jobs. So my kid is entering with a very low vocabulary, but excited about being at school, and quite frankly, if fostered, has the potential. Again, nobody's asked me, hey, can my kid be AIG? They're just like, hey, can you just not tell the kid they're not? Right? I think that excited about school, good habits, these are kids who are like, I got homework. When we don't foster that, then we do lose the potential of seeing these numbers to continue to look like this. Not because they couldn't be identified, but because they don't have the resources. So one of my little note catcher things is, how do we have other organizations who partner so that they can do some of those outside things, so that if there's a watch list, again, it's back to my community soapbox and I'll end there. I'm in a sorority that we have programs for kids. If one of the schools we adopted says we have these 5 kids who are on our watch list, guess what? We put them in our program. Right? We would give them the exposure they needed outside of that, but that doesn't currently exist. So that's why I was trying to kind of ask a few more questions about what does this watch list mean? How are we actually granting the exposure outside of the day? And especially when that kid doesn't have the resources when they leave that building. And not, again, I barely got the time and energy to do this with my own, and I only have 1 job, technically, maybe 2.
I do want to say in our conversations that we've had around this new plan, one of the tenets of this plan, although we can't go into all the details today, but it really is about how we can put systems and structures in place to identify and support kids without a singular test score or without, because we know that's why kids don't make it. We know there's inherent bias. We know that kids lack resources, and there are kids that we can see potential in that may not have come from a home with lots of vocabulary, and we need to be able to recognize that. And so that's really some of the work that we're trying to look at K2 is how we can really work on, so it's not just left up to a singular test. It's our responsibility to help identify these kids.
Mr. Haffey, Ms. Cashman.
So I had a bunch of questions which did not go into the right box, so you'll have to excuse me.
I like how you wrote it around your whole page.
Right.
She's AIG.
I'm not, surprisingly, but I do have memories.
This is observation.
Going to go do the fun stuff, and I'm just going back to the who's excited. Who's interested, who's excited, what is the push-in of the AIG teacher at the different grade levels versus the pull-out. Because when you have push-in, if you have that kid that's hanging around wanting to see what's going on, you have the opportunity to pull that kid in and maybe see something that you haven't seen. So what are we seeing at the different levels? I know pull-out has kind of gone by the wayside for a lot of services. Is AIG one of those? As far as, sorry, I don't know if you want me to stop or just keep asking my questions all at once.
Both of those are an option in our schools. So it's based on school leadership and what is needed at the school, but both is written into the plan as an option for student services.
And our AIG teachers have access to the PD and the support? Because, you're kind of in a silo when you're the only person in your school.
Absolutely.
But to see and observe what other teachers are doing at different schools and observe and ask questions about best practices.
Yes, and so that was one of when we mentioned regional meetings.
Yes.
So I know it sounds like just another meeting, but it's really a work session of schools that are like yours, and you're able to collaborate with them and get ideas and work on things that you normally wouldn't be able to with partnerships.
And then as far as professional development, and this for all levels, but do we have professional development for our teachers to look at their ELA, their math, curriculum, science, social studies within the AIG lens? If we look at EL alone, we have the classroom books, but there are the supplementary books, and how can we foster, if we're learning about poetry, here's a poem about a flower versus here's a higher level poem about a meadow that has nuance versus here's a big old poem from Victor Hugo, where you can, how do you stretch those talents, and are we able to provide our teachers with those supplemental materials so they can help our students stretch?
So they do have those materials, and I don't want to put them on the spot because
I see a few head nods behind me.
Right, and so we have our wonderful coordinating teachers. We have Andrea and Amy, who are in the process of looking through the resources that are available to teachers in EL and in math. And so we do have lessons, but they're making sure that there's that alignment. There's alignment to what's happening in the classroom and also alignment to standard. And so one of the sessions that we're offering this Friday, hoping for no storms, that is really talking about how do you access this curriculum and making sure that it's rigorous enough for our students, but is aligned to what's happening in the classroom. Exactly. So those are our dynamic duo and missing one.
First of all, I'm blown away by the AIG specialists that I've seen in our schools. I mean, I've gone to a lot of schools and they're wonderful. And we talk a lot, I'm 100% behind Standard 1 of more identification, but this board is going to have to figure out a way to fund Standard 3 and 4 in order for them to do the best job they can. Because if we need more identification, but then we need to figure out a way, and I hope that we can do this through finance, bring this back from the budget. Superintendent Moore, I'd like to talk more about our AIG funding, on how we're going to fund differentiated curriculum and all the things we expect our AIG specialists to do once we get more kids in the system, because our state's not doing it. And so hopefully we can talk more in finance about how we're going to give money into standards 3 and 4. So, because we're not giving you near the funding. I would love to know how our funding is, and I'll take care of this in finance. But
There's very little local funding.
I know. That's what, and it's local that we can only focus on, because we're never going to go above 4% in the state. You can change it. Yeah, we'll get a few people in there to change it, but so if we can look at our ratio just later on in finance to see just how we fund our AIG program based on the kids we're trying to serve now, even before we identify more, which I want to do.
So just, because you know me, I do some number stuff. So in the reports, numbers were out there. If you take the numbers that are provided for the 26,279 students.
Identified.
Based on the state formula where we're capped at 4%, the state assumes that it's basically $1,560 per student. But because we're capped at 14% and we actually have
4%.
We're capped at 4%.
Restrict you into 14.
Sorry. Since we're capped at 4% and we actually have 16.4%, the state's contribution ends up being $380 per student. So instead of $1,560, which is the state formula, with $380. There's, if you look at the local dollars that go to AIG, based on the 4% level, it'd be $394 per student. That turns into $96 per student with the actual numbers. So what we're doing is about $475 per student, when we should be doing closer to $2,000 per student. That's about where we are dollars-wise.
Okay, that's a good point. So,
Ms. Kushner, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Scott. You good?
Yeah.
Chris?
Okay, thank you. I really want to just thank Ms. Cash again for her advocacy on this issue. A lot of the questions, concerns I had are things that you've expressed. I hope we can come back and have another session on this program. I know that a lot of the questions and areas that I'd like to see are just too much to digest in this work session. As you've been presenting, I apologize, I've been trying to read through the plan. You know, I tried to read a little bit before we got here, tried to read a little bit in the context that you've explained. A concern I have, and I think you said a little bit about it, and it's come out again, is just the differences in AIG services from school to school. And if we want to have an array of programs for the total school community, you know, we need to at least inventory, if not reconcile, that we have different resources from school to school based on differences in identification. And then if there's different services, again, leadership determines, for example, how do we structure this in our school based on the resources we have? Do we have alignment between what one AIG child gets at one school, what they get at another school, say at elementary level, and then moving to an AIG magnet? And there's some that might be identified that have all that potential, but maybe they don't have the foundations that students at another school received. And I'd like, if we could, in a future meeting, to maybe dig a little bit deeper into because you might have good answers. I just know they're probably more complicated than we have time to get into right now. Finally, with identification, I know there's an issue with the twice exceptional students, and that becomes an equity issue as well, where some parents have been able to identify where a child might be academically gifted AIG through independent testing. They've been able to go and get. They also might have been able to go out into the health community and find out a student has a challenge with ADHD or autism, other sensory issues.
We are on the same page.
Okay, you got that right there. Whereas other parents don't have the resources to do that kind of testing, and so they wonder whether a child who seems so bright at home isn't performing well on this. And I know you have alternative means in there, and I have seen those in the plan. It's just I wanted to hear more about that. And then finally, Standard 5 partnerships. I would just ask that whoever's in charge here really go back and audit what you say you're doing. Because, I just know for a fact some of these things are not taking place. Because I was a member of some of these organizations in a leadership role that you say you have these partnerships with. And I just know for the last several years, there was no communication and no outreach going on. So I don't know where that ball is dropping, but if you could, these were all great ideas to partner with these organizations, but really go back, make the connection, and just verify that this is actually taking place. And I'm happy to tell you more about that offline in another, outside of the meeting.
Thank you.
Ms. Scott?
I read more in the plan itself and answered my own question.
I had one particular question in the plan itself. I was struck on page 6, the extent to which all testing is offered on the same day, irrespective of calendar. Is that something that's required by the state, or is that our practice? Because that just seems to make no sense given how many different calendars we have.
A quarter of the kids in year-round wouldn't be in school on that day.
And some would have been in school for a long period of time, others for a short period of time.
Can I have more information? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so this is on page 6 in nominations.
In the plan?
This is page 6 on the plan. It says testing windows are determined based on the number of instructional days in the school calendar. Therefore, schools, regardless of calendar, test on the same instructional day.
Same instructional day.
Oh, the number of days.
So it'd be the 100th
The number of
day.
days that they're actually in school, so that would fluctuate based on.
Okay. I read it as instructional day was.
I did too until you said it out loud. I'm auditory.
Yeah, no.
So day,
The 100th day.
Everybody in X number of time.
The 100th day of each calendar.
Okay.
Thank you for saying it out loud.
That did not communicate to me.
Me either.
The other question that I'd like to raise here is
Auditory people. I read it somewhere.
I'm a little concerned that so much of our AIG gets focused on math and ELA, and it seems like the way to meet the need is often compacting and acceleration. We haven't used that language extensively today, but it's there pretty clearly in the report. I think this actually gets at some of the equity issues as well, because there's a lot of kids who are pretty bright who are AID for whom acceleration and compaction isn't what we really need. It's depth, it's enrichment, and in fact, I can tell you from what I see at NC State, acceleration is rarely useful. It is for a few kids, but acceleration is rarely useful. Kids fly through and learn to be great procedurally. They become bright, intelligent AIG because they've been able to respond to prescribed material. But there's a big difference between that and the creativity, the depth, the learning. And so how can we shift our AIG from being quite the way we accommodate your need is we're going to put you into an advanced or an accelerated class, as opposed to either broader exposure or more depth, because I think that's going to create the kid who down the road when they get to college are going to be so much stronger, whereas if we've just accelerated you, it's sort of like the stone skipping across the water. That can go really, really fast, but you're really not getting the understanding that you're going to need when you need to draw on that deep level of learning. So how do we make a shift from acceleration to depth?
I don't know that we all want a shift. I don't know that we all want that shift, because I know accelerated learning is looked at very closely in our schools right now by parents of kids.
Oh, everybody wants it. I can just tell you that educationally it's not usually helpful for most kids.
Yeah, you say not everybody, but okay, some do. A good number do, but we have to be sure how we address it so it looks like we're doing it. It can't just be differentiated in the classroom, because we're asking our teachers to do way too much of that already. Be outside.
I'm talking about real stuff.
Okay.
I'm talking about real stuff.
So
but
let's
not
let
just
staff respond to that.
Like the difference between like an SSA versus enrichment? I mean, it's
maybe not so much SSA, but real problem-based learning. Let me just give you challenging problems that you're going to go into more depth, and you're going to build that greater capacity.
Well, do you need to be AIG to do Science Olympiad or Odyssey of the Mind or some of the things that we have extracurricular? And is that a way to get kids, to Monica's point, excited about coming to school and engaged in something that could spark that giftedness, that we spark something that we observe as their innate giftedness?
And those things are exactly what I'm talking about. That's going to give us actually more giftedness than just accelerating.
For everybody.
For everybody.
It sounds like y'all were sitting in the room in the meetings that we've had, and one of our major concerns is barriers and how we address barriers. We know that AIG is not about doing more and faster. It is about the learning that happens every day for you as a student in your classroom, and it is a lot of the 4 C's work. It is recognizing that giftedness is just it's not about the ability to move through something faster or to get a good grade or a certain score. There are lots of attributes to giftedness that we have to recognize, and that's what we've talked about, is how we begin to break down the barriers and look at it in a different perspective than maybe we considered in the past. So definitely, and we can certainly bring a Cliff Notes version back. The plan has a lot of things in it that we have to have that are required by the state, but there are also lots of nuances and discussions that have happened among this team that I think is really important for you to know about. That's really good stuff.
Thank you.
I mean, potentially for the whole board, but definitely for student achievement.
And just another note, the plan can be amended and revised at any time that we choose to do so moving forward as well.
All right. Any other questions? So good, robust discussion. We're almost back to on schedule with our schedule. Any other discussions for now? All right, so I believe this plan will come back to us at our next meeting for formal approval. But the work is ongoing and needs always full and rich conversation. So thank you for bringing this to me. Okay, the last item on our work session's agenda for today is the overview of the project for security and risk assessments on all of our school campuses.
Man, we are pushing a lot into short increments of time. That's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, we got a half hour. This is an overview. This is an overview of what's getting started. This is not the report out. This is the getting started.
Not 29. I know.
I have a whole different concept of time.
I think it will be appealed. Imagine we've seen that story before.
I have a different concept of time.
We can change those.
Okay, the Gardner.
Let's wait till tomorrow to
Who's leading the charge?
Good afternoon. We're glad to have this opportunity to be with you this afternoon to provide you this overview. And we're excited about this work, excited about the support the board is providing this work, because I believe it has a great opportunity for our schools and school district. Actually, Russ is going to make a few opening remarks and then introduce you to our guests we have here from Florida with us this afternoon.
Oh, you were glad to get away, I'm sure.
Did you bring it with you? I feel like you brought it with you.
We were concerned if they were going to be able to travel here, but they made it safely
They left their
yesterday.
families.
I just said it felt scary down there. It feels very law enforcement-y. Now I'm even more afraid that you're not
Anyway, thank you. You do have a PowerPoint that supports the comments that are going to be shared with you this afternoon. Again, big picture this afternoon as far as an overview. And Russ, I'm going to let you.
So just to give a little bit of background, in July of this year at the board meeting, you guys authorized us to engage the School Safety Advocacy Council to conduct comprehensive security risk assessments at every one of our school campuses. So I'm just going to kind of turn it over. We're excited to have with us today two members, two representatives from the School Safety Advocacy Council, Mr. Kurt Lavarello and Mr. Sean Burke.
And before they do get started, I just want to remind us that this afternoon is the purpose of providing a broad overview of the processes and timelines. The actual audit, the assessment just started today, but we want you, in launching it, to be familiar with the processes that they will take in working with our schools, as well as a timeline, knowing that in the end, some findings and recommendations will come back to you once that work is completed.
And I would just like to add to that, if I could, I'm sorry.
Very interested in this.
Okay. It's just that specific determinations of security vulnerabilities and the like at schools is going to be confidential closed session information. So those are not things that are rolled out publicly.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. As Russ stated, I'm Kurt Lavarello, and I serve as the Executive Director, one of the owners of the School Safety Advocacy Council. And so, as many of you may know, my background is that of law enforcement in the Broward County, Palm Beach County area of South Florida. And I'm still proud to call Florida my home as it is. I did travel. We did escape the storm before coming up here. And yes, I did leave my family behind. But I think we escaped a lot of it as it hopefully gets a little bit further east out there into the Atlantic. But thank you for having us here, and thank you for putting your faith in us as well for this project that we're moving on forward here. So I want to just start by telling you, aside from our vast background in school safety across the country, we work with some of the largest districts in the country, right down to some of the smallest one-room schoolhouses in the country. And we bring a lot of experience to the table, both Sean and I and our team that's here on the ground for the next few weeks. But I think more importantly, we also look at this as we're parents as well. And I always walk into every school with that in mind. If I were a parent, would I feel comfortable in putting my children in this school? And so that said, I also will preface this by saying, and I think we said it in our initial interview when we were brought here, we don't look at this as a welcome to Wake County and we'll see what we can get you on or play the gotcha game. We look at this as a partnership, that we're here with you and partnering with the Wake County School District, and we're very pleased to have the opportunity to do so. So moving through, just a little very brief here. I know we're under some time restraints, but this is a little bit about the School Safety Advocacy Council and the 4 main areas that we focus on in the country. The 2 that are very important, obviously, to us is training. We do a lot of training around the country. We are also the host, some of you may have seen it over the years, the last 15 years, the National School Safety Conference. That is us that puts that on. Each year we move that around the country. We also put on the National Conference on Bullying and Student Mental Health as well. Those are 2 of our larger events, and we are now hosting at least 9 regional events with the FBI in terms of the FBI Training Academy around the country on school safety and incidents across the country. Obviously here we're in the school safety assessment process, and we also work with a number of districts in the expert witness field as well. We work with the districts on sometimes the aftermath of something that may have happened and help them in their legal issues that may arise out of an incident. The school safety assessment process that we're here for, obviously, our team is on the ground. I'm so very, very proud to say I don't think you'll ever find a team like that we have here working with you and some of the other districts that we've done across the country. These folks are very, very energized, but they're also very, very focused. And so as they're visiting your campuses around the county, they'll be looking for specific strategies that are going to hopefully enhance your safety, but they also do focus on the things you're already doing well. And generally speaking, and we just completed day 1 here, I'm proud to say that they're finding a lot of things you're doing very, very well. We had a very brief meeting with them this afternoon before we came down here. And we have our war room that we go back to every afternoon here at our hotel and meet with our folks. We obviously look to reduce crime, violence, and disruptive behavior here, but we also look at ways to improve community relations. It takes a lot for a district to open it up and say, give us a good look at our district and how we're doing, and let us know the things we're doing right, but where there are also some opportunities to strengthen safety and security of our kids and our faculty and staff. Some of the philosophies that we operate under over the years is, that safety and security is everybody's responsibility in a district. It doesn't fall on one person, one name, one title at a specific school site. It's everybody's responsibility. We hope that our report will give you a good snapshot of the school district's safety and security processes, what you have. Again, we're looking to identify both the areas of strengths and areas that are improvement, and it's an ongoing process. We hope that even when we pull up our stakes and we move out of town, that this process is something that's ongoing, and I feel very confident that that's the case here as well. The team here, all of our team, I think I looked at, we're about 185 years experience in both law enforcement and specifically school safety, which is very, very important because safety in any other realm of the country, you have people out there doing ports and airports and manufacturing companies. Our folks are very focused on school safety. That's their element of experience. They wouldn't be on our team if they didn't have that experience. So they understand the education setting. They understand students, which is why when we came in, we don't subscribe to that gotcha style. We want each one of our team members to look at the principals, site principals at these schools as partners because it is a partnership. And when they come onto the campus of a school, they spend significant time there interviewing folks on the campus, the adults on the campus, as well as the several of the staff, the teachers. They're in the hallway, and some of it's informal, and some of it's more formal, where we're sitting down with a principal or a school nurse or a head of facilities and speaking with them. We're not product or service driven, so we're not recommending a particular product or service. We're recommending, more or less philosophies and using a little bit of what's called CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design standards that are out there, and as well as mixing that with national best practices in school safety. The site visit, again, started today. It's very flexible. Our team members understand the flexibility that's needed to go into the educational setting. We instruct all of them. We like to operate very under the radar screen while we're out of school. We don't walk into classrooms while we're there and interrupt class. We don't want to interrupt the teaching process. And we want to leave it as, even when our folks pull out of that particular school, we want there to be a dialogue so that there's something more a principal or a site manager wants to talk about with us later on, that they have that opportunity to do so. So we're very focused on what's working already. These are just some of the areas, a snapshot of some of the areas that our folks are looking for and looking at when they're visiting the schools. And I think these are the key areas that most of the schools across the nation are interested in. And those are the areas that they're focusing. But there's a lot of different areas that splinter off of each one of those marks you see up there as well. So I know myself here will be also looking at some of your extracurricular activities, some of your football games. I know myself I'll be visiting some of your games this Friday night if your weather stays on course.
You won't have to wait till Friday. It'll be tomorrow night.
Yes, exactly.
And we also, our folks that are out in the schools also look at not only the school center, but what's around that particular school center, and how that plays into the whole safety factor as well. So they're looking at a number of things as well. I always tell, I put this slide in there always because as I told you, we did a training here with some of the principals and the SROs here earlier before I came up for the assessment process. And I said, don't necessarily feel bad that we're seeing something that you may have not seen when you walked into a school. I served at a school for 20 years as both an SRO and an investigator with the school district. And we're creatures of habit. We typically do the same things. We enter the schools through the same way every day, and we typically follow the same patterns. And so if that tree that grows suddenly starts covering the entrance, the main entrance to a school, the average person may not notice it. And so, and that's just natural. Sometimes we'll tell people, just if you're in one school and you're in another school, flip for a day, and you're going to see completely different aspects of, as it relates to safety and security of children and staff. So my brief part is that. I know you've asked some questions, but we truly do value the fact that we're here and with you all, and if you have questions, but we do look forward to being your partner. I don't know if Sean has anything, but we look forward to the process and just keeping in touch. We have a great host, and it's been wonderful to work with for us as a department so far as we moved along. It's been wonderful in accommodating all of our needs as we move forward so far.
Thank you. Any questions, perspectives, information you'd like to get? Ms. Kushner.
Well, I appreciate the overview, viewing it more as a sort of audit assessment of our buildings. But one thing, and maybe it's not what you all do, but I would hope the staff would take into account, we don't see sort of softening of schools with social workers and counselors and school psychologists. We've been talking a lot about that to give kids that, to your point, school safety is everyone's responsibility. So how can we make sure that students view it that way, that their voice and their engagement is in keeping their school safe? So I don't know how we'll get into that for superintendent. That's a different level.
Well, we always do value above everything, and we go in and we teach varied topics from physical security to situational awareness. But I think the number one point we try to get across in all of our training, and even what we try to impart when we're on scene, is that the greatest safety measure you can have is relationships with the students. So that above all is what we stress, what we truly believe.
I think and just to follow on what Sean said, one of the probably the biggest questions we get asked all the time from media outlets all over the country after an event is, what's the number one thing our school district can buy? Is the bulletproof window or that bullet? And honestly, we're very people-oriented. I truly feel that people strategies are the number one strategies a school can engage to. Know your kids. That is where we have had the most success around the country in preventing these horrific
That's
tragedies.
the thing, right? That's the thing. Because if you can imagine the emails we get for every device and lots of different devices, and that's not the solution. Thank you.
Ms. Pam?
Just curious if the scope of your work also includes, best practices in communicating with parents if the school is going to have a lockdown drill either before or after, how to communicate using either trauma-informed practices.
I know we are looking over your policies and safety plans as well, and that would certainly be part of that, how the communication rolls out, yes.
Okay.
Scott? Mr. Sutton?
And thank you for the presentation. I know this is valuable, particularly from like an audit of physical buildings, and I really appreciate all of that. When I was looking at the school safety assessment slide, and identify specific strategies to make your schools safer, I wonder how you balance that with the delicateness of that might not. Some things might not make everyone feel safer. Given how is that differentiated when we think about safety policies to make sure that because that looks different for different people in terms of feeling safe. We've discussed this often where we acknowledge that having a SRO is not necessarily, that presence is not necessarily going to make everybody feel safer. So I'm just wondering how does that go into your work?
Well, I think a lot of that comes out too in some of the interviews, and we get to gauge the community and the staff because we do spend a considerable amount of time with the staff as well in that, and start to gauge where they would feel their level of comfort, because the level of comfort here in Wake County may be quite considerably different than the level of comfort it was when we did Los Angeles County, or when we do Clark County and Las Vegas. So that level of comfort may be different as we move around. But so we do rely heavily on some of those as engagements while we're here on the ground. We spend a lot of time just listening to the community, and something that we're not in our roles out there interviewing and interrogating people, but being in your restaurants, listening and going to your games, sitting next to folks and listening to what they say, reading your news. We spent a lot of time looking at your newspapers and the incidents that have occurred here. And so we build that, and we do try to compare and contrast sometimes, that difference, but you get a good feel for it when you're on the ground here locally. And we're not advocates of ever making any school look like a jail yard in any way, shape, or form. We get that, and you can't say that for a lot of the other companies that are doing this kind of work. They think that if we throw up a tower with an armed guard on it, that's going to solve all the problem. That's not us. So we're very, very people-oriented, and that plays into the solutions and the end report.
Mr. Sutton? Just quickly looking at the key assessment areas, I didn't see anything there around crisis management, so like lockdown drills, shooter drills, code red drills, all of that sort of stuff. Or is that part of your assessment, or does that sort of stop? Is that where law enforcement starts?
Well, the specific training obviously would be handled through the department with Russ, but we would look at is the level of training adequate? Is the level of drills adequate? And the relationships, the unique relationships, because you work with several law enforcement agencies in one district. So are they adequate for what would be a national best practice? But then the specific strategies and the specific training would be handled through the security and safety department. I hope that answers it.
I was trying to get at,
so we do evaluate.
Preventative, but still things will happen, so that, again, sort of crisis level management piece is that.
Yes, we do. There will be a review of the plan, an in-depth review of the plan that the county has, that the school district has. And also at each individual site, we review, are you doing your drills, the level of training, are the drills sufficient, are they done accurately, are they done effectively, and then the relationship with law enforcement. So that's the direction we take when we assess if your drills are being done correctly. And more than likely, we will have members on the ground or in the school when they do happen. So most likely they'll have some first-hand experience on them being run too.
Yeah, so as part of that, will you be looking at our memorandum of understanding with our law enforcement agencies?
We already have it.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. Good feedback. Thank you.
Didn't hear in your group, in your community groups, are you having specific engagement with students? Again, having been a parent, I know students actually have views of facilities that sometimes we adults don't pay attention to, and you can learn an awful lot if you can get a candid conversation in student groups.
So I'm going to address that one. They sure do. So we are working or in discussion and working on what the best way to implement getting that community and student feedback is. Again, it's not, we don't feel like it'd be a best practice to go out and reach students during the instructional day. And so we're looking at how to best implement that to gather that community feedback, because we do feel like that's important.
One other question, and I guess I would like you all sort of professional recommendation, and the gentleman who normally talks about this to us was here earlier but left. But we hear a lot about SROs and law enforcement in the building, and how that sort of criminalizing student behavior, so on and so forth. And we've heard recommendations, particularly around programs like I think he calls it peacekeepers or what have you, peace builders, where you're actually taking law enforcement out and replacing that with unarmed adults or men. I don't know exactly how it works, but how do you have thoughts, or any recommendations around the efficacy of programs like that? Do you have any experience with programs like that? And I'm not asking you to do that now, but perhaps in the report, can that be part of some of the some
Absolutely. Yes.
Having some external, I guess, unbiased opinion around that, I think, will be helpful for us, because we hear those things so much that it'd be helpful to just...
Yeah, we do look at that, and that would be part of it. I can tell you that part of one of the things we look at is I think the success of any SRO program across the country is based on really two key factors. The training of that person that's in the school, make sure, but probably more importantly is the selection of the right person for that school. And so, but yes, to answer your question.
You've heard that.
Yeah.
But alternatives and might be good to examine. What did you say? To look at some alternatives, maybe at our middle schools, to SRO, some of our... Maybe it's a point of discussion, maybe more for this board, but it would be good to get their feedback on alternatives to SRO, given their experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great, consider the line of work that you're in, just to see how you could see that fitting into or not fitting into certain situations.
Sure.
Well, I will share with you, these two gentlemen had the opportunity to speak to the principals and the SROs at the SRO Summit to also share an overview and a process and timelines, but took the opportunity to emphasize the importance of student relationships and building those relationships and building the opportunity to connect with students so that students feel comfortable sharing concerns, bringing forth information that might compromise the safety and security of the campus. That was a heavy emphasis in their remarks that they shared that day as far as the relationship and the importance of it, both administration, SRO, teacher, and student, as well as the broader community.
Well, thank you. As noted, this begins the work, and we'll look forward to seeing the report. As you got a sense, having heard our discussion earlier in the day, and this is a very engaged board. It really is looking to make schools be phenomenal places for kids. Because we know that what that does is it builds community, and it's the foundation of all the other stuff that we do, whether it's economic development or crime prevention or you name it. Schools are at the foundation. So thank you for being part of this work. All right, with that, I think we'll close work session and we'll reconvene for the board meeting in a few minutes.
This morning, my daughter was telling me about a lockdown in her school.
That's what Lindsay was saying.
Oh, yeah?
I sent a note to Tim and Russ and Paul Cohen, Student Sports Advice. I just sent